I'd like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have presence and deep connection to the land on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine, a part of which is known to Indigenous peoples of North America as Turtle Island. These lands are the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the Chippewas of Georgina Island, Rama, and Beausoleil, and of the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Dog Island, First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We would like to thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have been subjected to colonial oppression, which continue to this day. We acknowledge that the first step to reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous people and their inherent right to the land. We continue to create a better future for our relationships with Indigenous peoples and the land. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by ensuring healthy right forever. We recognize that working together with Indigenous peoples to include ecological traditional knowledge system thus towards an equitable system. How does the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust help? So about 90% of the land on the moraine is privately owned. And so we work with landowners to help protect important wildlife habitat found along the moraine. And we use a lot of different tools to do this. So land trusts are a type of environmental charity that can acquire land or interests in land. So a lot of what we have are called conservation easements. So people may still live on their land or still farm part of it and have a house and everything like that, but part of their property will be set aside to be protected habitat, and we will protect that from development forever. So we contribute to the federal government's goal of protecting 30% of land by 2030. We connect people with nature. We do educational programming like what we're doing tonight. We support climate change resiliency, and we help protect ecologically significant lands on and near the moraine, and we do that forever. We talked about the Ecological Gift Program. It's a really great way to get a tax break if you're a landowner. If you're going to donate your land, we have people who have donated stuff to us. We do outright purchases as well sometimes if there's a really special property that we want, but the majority of our properties are conservation easements. And there's a lot of legacy giving as well, people who include us, their plants, wills. Right now, we're in the middle of a really exciting project where we're restoring habitat for this endangered bird called the Kirtland's warbler out in Northumberland County by Ganaraska Forest. And this is a highly specialized bird that only breeds around the Great Lakes, primarily in Michigan. It used to be endangered in the United States, but it was just taken off the endangered species list there, but it remains endangered in Ontario, where there's historically been very few breeding pairs. They're habitat specialists. They only nest in two species of pine that are between 5 and 15 years of age. And historically, those pines were germinated, and that habitat was maintained through fires, many of which were controlled burns done by Indigenous peoples in the Great Lake region. And as those practices were suppressed, the numbers of the Kirtland's warblers dropped dramatically and they became endangered. We're doing some habitat restoration, and I'm actually going to share an opportunity with you all on one of the coming slides. You can help out with this. So we have a lot of exciting programming coming up over the next little while. It's overwhelming how many fun things we have. So to tie in with this presentation tonight, we have a guided walk this Saturday on September 21st at the Maple Cross Nature Reserve, which is in Schomberg, Ontario. We have seed collection field days. If anyone wants to collect the seeds of native species, they can email me at outreach@oakridgesmoraine.org or visit the workshop and events page on our website, and they can register to go out in the field on October 1st and October 2nd with a seed collection expert, and they'll learn how to collect and clean seeds of native species, and we'll use those for the Kirtland's warbler habitat restoration project. We have some fun webinars coming up in October. We have one on the bats of Ontario, which is Tuesday, October 8th. We have a guided tree ID walk on Saturday, October 12th, so that's at the Beaton Heritage Forest in Beaton, Ontario. We have a webinar coming up on October 22nd that's all about the biology of coyotes and wolves, which I'm super excited for. And we've just put this together. We're going to have a Halloween family movie night on Friday, October 25th. So I will throw a link in the chat in just a second here. But if anyone's interested in checking out any of these events or the volunteering opportunities, please follow the link, which I'll post in just a second. All right, so I'll throw that in the chat. Quite a few people here with us tonight. Thank you all for joining us. I will share my screen. All right, this is a presentation that I have called Falling for Autumn Birding. So here is one of the key species of fall birding in southern Ontario in the Oak Ridges Moraine region. This is the broad-winged hawk, and we'll talk about raptor migration in the presentation. But there are opportunities sometimes see hundreds of these birds migrating overhead in groups called kettles. And if you get to a hawk watching spot on a good day, usually in this part of the province when there's north or northwest winds, it can be really spectacular to see hundreds of turkey vultures or hundreds of broad-winged hawks going overhead, along with other cool species as well. So just a quick refresher. I did a similar presentation last winter all about winter birding, and we talked a lot about migration in that presentation. So some birds migrate and others don't. So here's an example of a bird that breeds here in the Oak Ridges Moraine region, the scarlet tanager. That's the red male there. And you can see on that map from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, everywhere that's sort of that peachy color is where they breed. So they breed up in northern Ontario, up by North Shore of Lake Superior and Lake Huron, and all through the lower Great Lakes region, and then down through the northeastern US. And then that yellow area is where they appear in migration, all through Florida and Central America and the Caribbean. And they overwinter all the way south from Panama into Colombia, Ecuador, and even Bolivia. So they travel thousands of kilometers each spring and each fall to migrate. It's a lot of effort to go to. So why do some birds migrate? Well, it's often related to the availability of food. Migration is often driven by changing seasons, as we mentioned, usually in fall and spring, and by changes in the length of days that activates hormones in the birds' bodies that encourage them to migrate. And a lot of the birds that migrate in the Oak Ridges Moraine region migrate here for the availability of insects. So a lot of the warblers, a lot of those neotropic migrants, the flycatchers and things like that, they're eating insects, which we don't have a ton of in Ontario in the middle of the winter, as well as things like nectar. So if you think about your hummingbird, species like that. Who migrates and who doesn't? This is interesting to think about. If you look on the left here, we have a species called the northern shrike. And you can see by that map there, that blue area is where they spend their winters. So that's, you can see in the southern Ontario and the Oak Ridges Moraine region. And then they breed all the way up in like northern Quebec and Labrador and just on the north shore of James Bay there in Ontario and up through the territories in northern Manitoba. So they breed way up in the tundra, and they only spend their winters here. And they're a species that migrates here for a different food source. They like to eat rodents in particular. They'll eat other birds as well. Shrikes are the one family of carnivorous songbirds that we have here. But if you look at the blue jay on the right here, their map shows that some of them breed up in northern Ontario, up in the boreal forest. And then some of them will overwinter in the southern US. And then some of them, you can see that purple area in the northeast there, will spend the whole year in the same area. So you can have blue jays coming to your feeder in January as well as June. But it's actually a good chance that they're different blue jays. So the ones that spend the winter with us may have migrated from only a few hundred kilometers north. And they were driven by searching for food, the availability of things like beech nuts, things like that. And that may be why in some years more of them fly south, depending on the mast of those crops. So this time of year, you can often see big groups of blue jays flying overhead, and they have that characteristic sort of squawking call. You can see the big flocks of them overhead, and they may be migrating just a few hundred kilometers. They do migrate too, but some of them may also just hang around. I know when I was a kid, it was always considered like a sure sign of spring that robins would show up. But more and more robins each year are overwintering in southern Ontario and around the Moraine, which likely has to do with climate change and the milder and milder winters we've been having. This is one of the most incredible migration stories we have in North America and indeed in the world. So the ruby-throated hummingbird is one of the tiniest birds we have in Canada. Hummingbirds are the smallest bird family. They only weigh about the same as a couple of tunies. They're just a few ounces, and they can breed, up in the boreal forest and in up around the Oak Ridges Moraine region, and all through Manitoba and Saskatchewan and into Alberta. And they migrate thousands of kilometers each year to Central America, and particularly to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And they'll fly all the way over the Gulf of Mexico in a single flight, which is absolutely incredible. It's something like 800 miles. And they're able to do that by shifting their metabolism into a different state. And normally they have to feed really regularly. A lot of people have heard that story about hummingbirds have to feed every 10 or 15 seconds. Well, that's an exaggeration. They do have to feed pretty regularly to stay alive when they're active. But they bulk up in southern Florida before they fly over the Gulf, and consuming just way, way, way more calories than they normally would and putting on a lot of weight. And then they shift their metabolism, and they're able to survive that flight all the way over the Gulf of Mexico. So it's an absolutely incredible phenomenon. The fact that they do it all is really remarkable. When does fall migration start? A good question. Believe it or not, it begins in July, which is not usually a month that we associate with the fall. So some of the earliest birds to migrate in this part of the world are shorebirds. And for some of these species, there's a really long window over several months when they're migrating. So like I mentioned earlier, in the spring, oftentimes you'll have species coming in, and it'll seem like they're just in our part of the world in southern Ontario for a week or two on their way up to breed in the boreal forest, and they're just passing through so quickly, a lot of those warblers. But fall migration tends to be a lot slower and more drawn out. So these are some of the species that you can find in July and August in places like sewage lagoons and farmers' fields and along the shores of Lake Ontario. Things like solitary sandpiper, lesser yellowlegs, least sandpiper. A lot of these species are still moving it through, perhaps smaller numbers. And the reason why a lot of them migrate so early is what I call the tundra singles club. So a lot of these species breed way up in the Arctic tundra, like you can see on this map here for the semi-palmated sandpiper, up in that sort of peachy area there. So they breed all the way up in like northern Ontario on the shores of James Bay. I know a few people who've actually gone up there to do shorebird surveys and to study them up there, which is super cool, and up in places like Churchill, Manitoba, and all through the territories as well. And those birds that are migrating through in July and August are really early birds that start off fall migration. A lot of them are tundra breeding shorebirds that never found a mate. And so they decide that they want to get ahead of the crowds and begin their migration early. So scientists call them failed breeders. And they're usually So here are a few species that are still on the move in this part of the world when it comes to shorebirds. Some of them in greater numbers than others. The black-bellied plover, American golden plover are very similar in their non-breeding plumage and can be very tricky to tell apart. Some of the phalaropes are moving through. I know there's been reports of Wilson's phalaropes over the last week and a half, spots around this part of the province, as well as redneck phalaropes, and then things like Dunlin, Barrett's-side sandpiper, white rump sandpiper, pectoral sandpiper. They tend to be sort of later migrating species compared to some of their relatives. May have started to head out in July or August. And here are a few spots close to the Oak Ridges Moraine where you're liable to see shorebirds this time of year. One surprisingly excellent place to see shorebirds are the farm fields around Beaton, Ontario, specifically the sod farms. You get really interesting birds in there, particularly known for the buff-breasted sandpiper, which is a pretty rare species to see in migration in southern Ontario. They're a tundra breeding sandpiper that's really gorgeous. They're this sort of buffy golden yellow color. They almost look like a dove, and they're in sharp decline, their population of the climate breeding habitat. So they're quite special to see. You also get things like black-bellied plover and American golden plover. near there. But it's important to remember that this is all private property, and if you go to these farm fields around Beaton, you'll be parking on the side of country roads where there is traffic. So don't trespass on people's property. We love farmers. We love all that they do for us. We don't need birders trespassing in farm fields. Unfortunately, that happens a fair amount of time. Gotta be respectful of other people's property. If we start down by Mississauga, places like Rattray Marsh is a great place to see shorebirds pretty much anywhere with mud flats, which is sort of the muddy, shallow areas, flooded fields, flooded beaches, where there's a lot of the invertebrates that these shorebirds like to feed on and bulk up on. They stop to rest, feed during migration. They need a lot of energy to make it all the way to Central America or the southern US. Toronto, Woodbine Beach, Tommy Thompson Park is excellent, Colonel Sam Smith Park. And then if we move a little bit further into up by Scarborough, we have Rouge Beach, Frenchman's Bay in Pickering, Lynn Shores Conservation Area is incredible. Dixon's Point, Second Marsh in Oshawa and Darlington Provincial Park are great. Up by Markham, Reeser Pond is a remarkable place. There's really this tiny pond at the side of the highway that you can see while you're driving by that looks totally innocuous, but because so much of the area is developed, it's a really important stopover for migrating waterfowl and shorebirds and things like that. So really incredible birds have turned up there over the years. And there's some really dedicated local birders that found some incredible stuff day after day after day and putting those hours in. A little bit further afield, Presqu'île Provincial Park up Coburg is incredible up by Brighton. Particularly well known in November for a species called the purple sandpiper, which is a really late migrating shorebird that often stops at a place called Gull Island there on their way through. Although the past 10 or so years, Tommy Thompson Park in Toronto has pretty consistently had purple sandpipers as well. Just seeing in the chat, Kathy has asked, what was the bird I mentioned near Beaton? That was the buff-breasted sandpiper, but other species show up there as well, like the American golden plover and the black-bellied plover. Most of the shorebirds you're going to see migrating this time of year are killdeer, which is one of our more common shorebird species, and they breed in a variety of habitats, railway beds and farm fields and things like that. So a lot of the birds, shorebirds you'll see are killdeer. They're more common ones. And I have this in red at the top of the page. Don't forget your local sewage lagoon. I know it doesn't sound fun to most people, but if you're an avid birder, you have to go check out your local sewage lagoon. They're for similar reasons as Reeser Pond, because there's been so much development and so many wetlands and mudflats have been lost since European colonization. There's not as many places for these birds to stop over when they're migrating as there used to be. And so, gross as it may sound, sewage lagoons are very attractive, and they have a lot of insects and vertebrates and things like that live there. And oftentimes the water is a little bit warmer. They open during the winter months. So yeah, some sewage lagoons are totally open to the public to go bird whenever you want. Some of them are closed and you shouldn't trespass them. Some of them are open sometimes. Some of them require permits or special permission or require you to be a member of a local naturalist club. So if you're curious about local sewage, do your research and ask some birders. You can email me and I'll do my best to get the information to you. Yeah, it's always one of the great things about being a birder is checking out places like garbage dumps, the downtime. Fall raptor migration. This is something that people get really excited about. It's one of my favorite parts of fall migration. We have a picture here of a golden eagle, and that's a species that we only really see in most of Ontario in migration, particularly in the fall right now, closer to October, November. So the reason why we see a lot of these birds and to help sort of understand their behavior in migration, I have introductory physics for turkey vulture. So a lot of us have seen that characteristic shape of the turkey vulture, that kind of V dihedral, as they sort of float on the air. And if you ever watch a turkey vulture floating on the air like that, you'll notice that they don't flap their wings very much. It's pretty remarkable. And what they're doing is they're riding something called a thermal or a thermal column. And that is a pocket of warm air, and you can see it in the diagram there on the left, that rises. Warm air rises. It's similar to an updraft, which is an upward current of air. And migrating raptors like eagles, hawks, and turkey vultures use thermal. It helps them save energy in migration. They're not flapping much and putting much energy into it. Air current is air moving from one area to another. These are some basic concepts in meteorology that have a bearing on the movement of species. Of course, a major obstacle to their migration, Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are huge, and most birds don't want to fly over them because there's a risk that migrate to the other side. And a lot of those birds that do end up migrating over, even wider areas of water, like the Gulf of Mexico, like those ruby-throated hummingbirds, a lot of them don't end up making it. A lot of them get lost out at sea. So most birds, and especially raptors, will try to hug the shoreline, and they'll try to ride those air currents and those thermals to be as efficient as possible and not expend unnecessary energy. So if you live on the lower Great Lakes, on Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, days with a northwest wind or a north wind can be really good for raptor migration. These strong winds on these days will push the birds closer to the shoreline, closer to the lakes. But weaker winds will keep the birds more north. If you live in Toronto, sometimes in the fall on days with a weaker northwest wind, you see big groups of turkey vultures or broad-winged hawks or things like that moving along Davenport Road or St. Clair. And they sort of tend to follow along the historic shoreline of Lake Iroquois, which was one of the glacial predecessors to the modern day Great Lakes, Lake Ontario. And you can sort of see that ridge along Davenport in Toronto, where the shoreline of Lake Iroquois was tens of thousands of years ago. And I chatted with a friend earlier today to clarify a few points here, and he was mentioning that because of the weather conditions this particular year, a lot of the birds have been bypassing the Toronto area entirely, and a lot of sort of the path of raptor migration has been going through like Lambton County in southwestern Ontario. A lot of interesting raptors there, but not so much my neck of the woods, just Maine. This is sort of a rough calendar that'll give you a rough timeline of when these birds are moving through, based off of several thousands of observations recorded on the website eBird. People love to track migrating raptors. A formal hawk watch at High Park in Toronto that we'll talk a little bit about in a minute, as well as Cranberry Marsh at Lynn Shores Conservation Area and Rosetta McLean Park in Scarborough. And people will go out there and they'll sit for hours on end in their camping chairs and they'll count every bird that goes over. They'll tally it. And people have been doing this for decades and decades and decades, and it gives us really good information about the movement of these birds and how their populations are doing. So it's a really great longitudinal data come out of these hawk watches. So broad-winged hawks are amongst the first species to move through from late August to early October. You can get things like ospreys around that time as well. They're a really interesting raptor species that's live in their own family, and they primarily eat fish. They can go to the southern U.S., to Central America and Mexico, is where they spend their winters, where there's open water and fish to eat. And a lot of our falcons, which are actually more closely related to parrots and songbirds, believe it or not, than they are to hawks and eagles, recent genetic work has shown. A lot of the falcons are moving through this time of year. So we get things like American kestrels, merlins, and peregrine moving a little earlier. A little bit later in the raptor migration calendar, you get the bald eagle. And then the two accipiters, the sharp-shinned hawk and the Cooper's hawk, um, which are extremely similar looking species, but the sharp-shinned hawk is very petite, close in size to a dove or a blue jay, and they have more of a they have a distinct shape to their tail, and the shape of the head is a little bit more rounded off and a little bit more proportionate looking. The Cooper's hawk has a really huge looking, more angular head, more squared off. And the position of the eye as well is another good ID feature on those. Turkey vultures through from late August to late November, so there's a really long window where they're moving through this part of the world. And then a little bit later, we have the northern harrier, which is a bird of open country, grasslands, and prairies that specializes in eating voles, starting to move through. Red-tailed hawks can be tricky because we do have our resident red-tailed hawks that'll overwinter here and spend the whole winter here. So if you're at a park hawk watching, the red tails that you see flying around might just be the neighborhood ones that breed there. The red-shouldered hawk is exciting to see. It's a bird we don't see a ton of in the Oak Ridges Moraine area or around Toronto in the breeding season because they require large areas of intact forest. There's places like up north of Kingston near like Opinicon Road and Canoe Lake Road where you can find them breeding, and in larger, more intact forest blocks. But they're sort of like the forest counterpart of the red-tailed hawk. So it's cool to see them come through here during migration. And then these are some of the the later ones in the year. The golden eagle tends to be in November, early November is sort of when they peak, and they come through in smaller numbers than the bald eagle. Juvenile golden eagle can look quite similar to the juvenile bald eagle can look quite similar to the golden eagle. So use your eagle eyes to tell them apart. The rough-legged hawk is a cool species. They nest up in the tundra. They're a northern bird, and sometimes you can find them in farmers' fields, in places like Amherst Island, out by Kingston, or Wolf Island, or anywhere that's sort of a grassland prairie habitat, like Downsview Park in Toronto. Sometimes they'll overwinter and hang out there, just eating rodents all winter. And then much rarer is the American goshawk, and they're another species that likes to breed in sort of larger intact forests. They're a pretty uncommon, pretty rare breeding species in southern Ontario, but you can sometimes get them later in the hawk watch flying overhead. And they're an accipiter, so they're in the same family as the Coopers and sharp-shinned hawk. And then every once in a while you get a rarity like a black vulture. Oh yeah, Brian Mills is correct in the chat there. Beamer Conservation Area in Grimsby is a great place for watching hawks, and they do have a hawk watch there as well. Keeping track of that data for decades and decades. So I'll just go briefly through some of these silhouettes to help you tell apart some of the birds. There's a really fantastic book called Hawks in Flight that I have included in the resource materials at the end of the presentation that I recommend you getting, but there's a lot of great resources for free online that'll show you the different silhouettes and shapes. You can see the Buteo, which is the family of hawks that has members like the red-tailed hawk, the red-shouldered hawk, the rough-winged hawk, rough-legged hawk, sorry. They tend to have these sort of broader, bulgier wings, and they tend to have that broader, spread out tail a lot of the time. They look like they have this sort of like muscular bicep appearance to their wings, versus the accipiter, which tends to be sort of slimmer and have that long tail and have the thinner wing. And accipiters flap their wings much more frequently than buteos. And then falcons, which have that really streamlined, angular shape, almost like a swallow. They have this really fast bat-like flight where they move their wings really, really quickly. As you sort of move up in size, the birds flap their wings a little less frequently. So eagles do a lot more soaring, less flapping, and vultures, as we talked about earlier, will just sort of float around in that dihedral shape without doing very much flapping at all. They can just go minutes and minutes riding those thermals without flapping their wings. So the flight pattern can actually be a really good tool to help you figure out what bird you're looking at. And here is a little bit more detailed guide to some of those silhouettes. So, you can see there's differences in the shape. The red-tailed hawk has a little bit more of a bicep-y bulge to the front of its wing, the leading edge versus the red-shouldered hawk, which is a little bit more concave. The broad-winged hawk has that really distinctive sort of, broad, it's not broad wing as the name suggests, and the distinctive band to its tail. And you can see the accipiters are a little bit more longer tail and a little bit leaner. So here are a few hawk watching destinations. In addition to Beamer that was just mentioned out in Grimsby, there's the Heber Down Conservation Area, which is north of Oshawa, up by Whitby, and Lynn Shores Conservation Area, also known as Cranberry Marsh, the marsh there. Got another like long-term hawk watch. There's Rosetta McLean out in Scarborough, and High Park. There's a spot called Hawk Hill, which is right next to the Grenadier Restaurant. And yeah, if you go anytime between sort of the mid-September through to the end of November, you'll find people on days with north or northwest winds camped out in their lawn chairs, keeping track of all the hawks that go overhead. Sometimes you can see really cool stuff. So it's definitely worth a visit. All right, so fall warblers are the bane of every birder in Eastern North America. So I have a quiz here, sort of tongue-in-cheekly put together to ask if people can tell apart these three birds. Imagine too that they're 50 feet away from you and they're moving a lot and none of them are singing. And this is the plumage that they're all in. These are three of the most notoriously difficult to tell apart fall warblers: the blackpoll, the pine, and the bay-breasted. And jokingly, a lot of birders will talk about baypole warblers in the fall if they can't, identify it down to a species. Yeah, even this year I've seen these moving through, and it's just very difficult unless you get a really good look sometimes, especially if they're dense in the leaves, moving around a lot. There are some subtle field marks, as well as the timing of when they move through. The bay-breasted, I believe, earlier than the blackpoll. I could have that reversed, but I think that's right. Blackpoll warbler has orangey feet. So if you get a good enough look at the bird to see its feet, the blackpoll warbler, that's distinctive compared to the pine and the bay-breasted. There's different levels of streaking on the sides on different species. Like the blackpoll tends to be streakier than the bay-breasted. And the other sort of smoking gun, if you can get a good enough look, is the undertail coverts. So in like the bum area of the bird where the tail connects to its back, they're white on the blackpoll warbler. They tend to be buffier on the bay-breasted, sort of a tanner color. The wing bars are a good field mark for the pine warbler. They're not very contrasty versus the blackpoll, bay-breasted. But these are all pretty minute details, and a lot of the time you just have to be comfortable admitting that you don't know what bird you're looking at. And that's one of the trickiest parts of birding, but it's something that everybody has to learn at some point, is to be comfortable saying that you can't get it down to a species level, to accept that humbleness. So some of these birds, thankfully, keep a pretty similar plumage throughout the year. These three species don't. You can see the blackpoll warbler on the top left there in its breeding plumage. It's black and white and stripy. It kind of looks like a black and white warbler. In the spring, the pine warbler is very yellow and a little bit streaky there. And then the bay-breasted, the breeding male warbler, has that really beautiful reddish color on the sides there. So they look completely different in the spring, but in the fall, their plumage changes. A lot of the birds we see in the fall migrating are first-year birds. They're chicks that were born this year, and they're migrating south for the very first time. So they're in an immature plumage. And some species, it gets very complicated, the differences. But these ones here, they're pretty consistent with their plumage. So they'll look the same in spring migration and fall migration. But the ovenbird, the two water thrush species, the northern being far more common in southern Ontario. The Louisiana is more sort of right around Lake Erie and the very southern tip of Lake Ontario. The black and white warbler, which is the one that moves up and down tree trunks, kind of like a nuthatch or a woodpecker. as well as the golden-winged and blue-winged and the orange-crowned warbler. So those ones have consistent plumage, which makes things much easier. So it sort of takes these off the map as species you have to learn second fall plumage for. And then there's a lot of species that are pretty consistent. They might be a little bit more faded in the fall in their non-breeding or their immature plumage, but they look pretty similar to how they look in spring. So this is also very helpful. A species like the northern Perula, which is on the lower left there, the colors will be a little bit more muted, or something like the Canada warbler, which is in the lower left-hand corner. That black necklace will be a little bit more gray, sometimes a little bit less conspicuous, but they will basically look very similar to the way that they look in spring. Now, this is where we start to get into the fun stuff. Some species, the first-year males resemble females. So here's a black Burnian warbler, a first-year male, and they look very similar to a female. Same with the American redstart there. In fact, I don't know if it's possible with these species a lot of the time to tell whether it is a first-year male or it is a mature female. The redstart there has that yellow on its side, on its wing, and on the side of its tail there. So a lot of the redstarts we see some of these look like that. The Blackburnian warbler, we'll talk about it in a little bit, sort of retains a similar shape to its plumage, but the colors are a little bit more muted compared to the breeding males. It has that sort of that triangular cheek patch thing going on, so it looks a little bit like a less showy version. In some species, there are males and females with the same breeding and non-breeding plumage. So in the palm warbler, we have on the left non-breeding adult, which is a pretty drab gray bird with a yellow undertail. And then you see the breeding adult on the right, and they have that really nice sort of brownish red patch on the head, and they're much warmer, cinnamon color to the wings and the back, and a lot more yellow in the underside. But this time of the year, they're looking a lot more drab. So both the males and the females have the same breeding and non-breeding plumage, which simplifies things a little. This is an interesting example too. Similar, you can see the breeding male chestnut-sided warbler compared with the non-breeding male. The chestnut-sided warbler, the breeding female on the right, compared with the non-breeding female, or first-year male or first-year female. There's a lot of overlap between the different plumages, and it's hard to tell which one's which. So the non-breeding male and the female non-breeding look very similar. They're one of the most distinctive fall warblers, actually. They have this sort of like almost lemon green, yellow coloration to them, which really stands out when you're in the field. And the breeding male and breeding female are also very similar, differing just a little bit. Patterning face. As I sort of alluded to earlier, a lot of tricky fall warblers are first-year birds that look like a faded version of their adult show. On the left, we can see this first-year male Cape May warbler, and on the right, you can see a breeding male Cape May. And even though the breeding male is a lot more colorful, that same basic pattern of the streaks on the breast and the shape of the cheek patch there, that's sort of like a capital D or a curve, as well as that distinct eye line, they're all there. Even the patterning, like that dark on the top of the head, that's like a cap almost. So they have a really similar pattern. It's just a lot more faded in the first year birds. So if you learn to study the patterns and the shapes of the of like the cheek patches, things like that on the breeding birds, it can be kind of helpful for relating that to the non-breeding plumage fall migration. Here's another example on the side. On the right side here, we have a non-breeding magnolia warbler. And over here on the left, we have a breeding bird, and very similar. It has those streaks on the breast, but they're a lot more faded in the fall. And you can see its face is covered, and it has that similar sort of shape to the cheek there, that sort of triangle under its eye. But it's just a lot more drab. And even the prairie warbler, this is a species we hardly ever see in migration, fortunately, because they're in such decline. but they're beautiful birds. And same sort of thing. They have a shape like an uppercase V underneath their eye. That's sort of that hollow cheek patch. And you can see it in the your bird on the right, as well as the breeding there on the left. However, tricky fall warblers are not the end of the challenges of fall birding. One of the biggest problems, besides the fact that there's more leaves out on the trees than there often is in April and May, although this year, because of climate change, I was at Peely in like the first week of May, and there was leaves on every tree, and usually that's not the case. So everything's sort of up in the air with climate change, some of these patterns. But one of the big problems is birds aren't as vocal in the spring as they are like in the fall. They're not calling or singing as much because they've bred. They've already established their territories and they're leaving and they're headed south for their wintering grounds. They don't need to vocalize as much. And for some species like the willow flycatcher and the alder flycatcher, it's borderline impossible to tell them apart in the field. I know I'll get emails and comments from people being like, it has this field mark and this field mark. For most birders, it's extremely difficult, and you'd want to just leave that as empedonic species on your list. You wouldn't want to try to tell it apart. These two, I believe until the 1980s, were considered one species, Trails flycatcher, and then research on their, primarily based on their calls, had them split into two distinct species. But a lot of members of that family, the empedonic flycatchers, are very hard to tell apart. The least flycatcher can look a lot like the yellow belly flycatcher, can look a lot like the Acadian flycatcher. So it can be very tricky to tell these birds apart, particularly in the fall. Now, fall is also a time when ducks are moving through. Ducks and geese and other species of waterfowl. We have a picture there showing some trumpeter swans. This time of the year, we see those bees of Canada geese moving through. And a lot of those birds are actually ones that are moving from northern Ontario and migrating south. We, of course, have the resident Canada geese now that were widely reintroduced in the mid-20th century. So we have the ones that hang out in city parks, lawns, and golf courses. Most of them aren't going to fly south. They have enough food, and the human modified landscape provides them with such a great habitat, all the grass to eat. So they're not going to leave. But a lot of those flocks you see moving overhead this time of the year are actually migrating Canada geese. And then interesting stuff turns up too. Like see on the lower left-hand corner, there's a bird that looks like a little Canada goose. That one's called a cackling goose. And up until the early 2000s, around 2001, they were considered just a subspecies of the Canada goose, but then genetic work indicated that they're actually a separate species. So if you see a big flock of Canada geese in the fall, and there's one that's really small, about the size of a mallard duck, with a stubby neck and a stubby bill, you could be looking at a Canada goose. Although there's also the minima subspecies of the Canada goose, which can overlap in size with the cackling goose. They're very small compared to the greater Canada goose, which we're used to seeing in like city parks. So it can be a little bit confusing. That other bird there, that goose on the top left corner there, is called a brant. They're a relative of the Canada and cackling goose, and sometimes you can find them in flocks of Canada geese. They're all black like that. Tundra swans are moving through. Sometimes you'll see that bird that's sort of in the middle on the bottom to the right of the tundra swans is a greater white-fronted goose. They're another species you can find sometimes in those mixed geese flocks. And then some of those other species on the page as well. We have the blue-winged teal, northern shoveler, hooded merganser, red-breasted merganser, and lesser scaup. And those species are all moving through right now. Some of these birds, like the tundra swans and the brant, breed way up in the tundra, and they're moving through on their way to their winter right now. And then we have a lot of species of ducks that overwinter in this part of the year. So a lot of them as well are either breed in the boreal forest. Ones like the bufflehead, which is that really tiny duck on the lower left-hand side, will nest in holes in trees, believe it or not. Same with the goldeneye, which is the right of it there on the bottom line. They are both cavity nesting ducks, which seems very strange. Some of these species, like them, breed up in the boreal forests, northern Ontario's. Other ones, like the long-tailed duck, second from the right on the bottom row, um, that breed way up in the Arctic tundra, and they overwinter here. So these ducks will move in this time of the year, and they'll spend the whole winter here. Anywhere along the waterfront in around the GTA and on the north shore of Lake Ontario can be fantastic. You're seeing these places like Lynn Shores, um, Frenchman's Bay, Colonel Sampson Park, Bluffers Park, Rattray Marsh. Tommy Thompson is incredible. Used to be really great to go to Ontario Place to look for overwintering ducks, but Doug Ford took that from us, unfortunately. Yeah, we have a lot of species of waterfowl moving right now. Cool. So I've included here a few great resources that some of these I consulted when putting together this presentation. Sibley Guide to Birds, which is on the bottom there, is just the greatest field guide ever together. It's just an absolutely fantastic resource. It's so intuitive. It's laid out so elegantly. The illustrations are fantastic. I can't recommend it highly enough if you're interested in birds and birding. The Warbler Guide goes a little bit more into the nitty gritty and some of those, like first year breeding plumage, first year versus breeding plumage versus first year male versus, all that stuff. So if you want to have a slightly more advanced understanding of warblers, particularly fall plumage of warblers, it's a good resource. It breaks it down in a pretty accessible way too. Hawks in Flight is a really great book. If you're interested in hawk watching at all, I would really strongly recommend that one. It has really wonderful illustrations, also by David Sibley, that do a really great job of showing how the hawks look in flight overhead. There's free resources as well. There's a download the Hawks of North America silhouette guide, but hawk migrations of America. That's free. Order like a laminated copy if you want, for very cheap, or you can off home. And then there's a really amazing app. If you haven't downloaded Merlin by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I would highly recommend that as well. It helps to identify bird songs, calls, although it's not foolproof. It's a pretty good starting point if you're trying to identify an unknown bird song. But it also lets you know which species are likely to be in the area or at a specific location for that date. So it's a really great tool if, say you're going to go to Killbear Provincial Park in October. You can put in the location and the date you're going to be there, and it'll show you alphabetically or by how likely they are or by family, all the birds that you're likely to see there. It's a really great way to plan birding trips or to learn the birds that are right in your backyard at any given point. I can't recommend Merlin highly enough as well. That's the end of the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if anybody has any questions about fall migration, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'd be happy to do my best to answer. Has anybody been going out and doing any birding this past little while? I know for me, it's always hard moving from like the summer breeding season when there's not as much going on and the birds have gone quiet, are nesting, taking care of their young, into the getting back into it for the fall. But yeah, I've been out times in the past. The thrushes through with thrush, which was. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, Elizabeth Stone asked, oh, Brian Mills says that he saw tundra swans and Lake Wilcox. I love them. So Elizabeth Stone says, in fall, I do not see hooded or common mergansers in male plumage. Do the males change plumage? And if not, where are they? That's a really good question. I believe that the hooded merganser and the common merganser both have a consistent plumage all year round. Sometimes I know they're in sex segregated groups. So I've seen like a bunch of male hooded mergansers hanging out together at the Toronto waterfront, or a bunch of females hanging out together. But that might be part of the reason why you're seeing only the female type ones. Um, yeah, I believe though that both the common and hooded males have the same plumage all year round. Yeah, do we have any other questions here? All right, thank you for everyone who's joined us tonight. I really appreciate being able to chat with everyone. I'll throw the link in the chat one more time for the events page on our website. If anybody wants to check out any of the webinars or events or anything like that we have coming up over the next little time. Oh, somebody asked, we had a plague of grackles for 2 days last weekend. Are they preparing for migration? That's a great question. They are. Time of year, you can see really big mixed flocks. They're called blackbirds. So you get grackles, red-winged blackbirds. Sometimes you'll get the odd rusty blackbird in there, which is always nice to see. They're another species at risk, which is experiencing big population decline. But they like to nest up in the forest, like beaver ponds and wetlands, which is really cool for a blackbird. So they'll get together in these big mixed flocks that can have thousands, several hundred birds, and they'll get ready to move through. So they'll stage for a little while. They'll all take off when the weather's favorable. I know I was at a spot a few days ago where there's quite a few barn swallows that nest, and they're all gone. Swallows are some of the first birds to move out and migrate. They're very early migrants, and they can also form these big mixed flocks. I've seen it before in the late summer where there's just hundreds of tree swallows gathering together and getting ready for the conditions. I have somebody asking, which birds are we expecting to see on Saturday? That's a really great question. So we'll see some resident birds, ones that don't migrate, that spend the whole year here. Things like the red-tailed hawk or some of the blue jays. And most of the woodpeckers don't migrate. The only woodpeckers that really migrate in this part of the world are the red-headed, which is another species at risk we don't see very much. Yellow-bellied sapsucker and the the northern flicker. They eat a lot of ants. So you can't get as many ants feed on the ground the way that they often do in the winter. So they'll fly south. But we'll see things like a lot of the regular birds that overwinter, like goldfinches, crows, chickadees, mourning doves, cardinals, robins, things like that. In terms of migratory birds, we could have great blue herons starting to move through. They can often hang around until water freezes over, and a lot of the time, them in larger bodies of water, so they're hanging around by the shore throughout the winter even. Same thing with kingfishers. As long as there's open water and places for them to fish, they will often hang around. Wood ducks are starting to migrate right now. Some of the warblers are moving through too. Things like yellow-rumped warblers, yellow throats. Some of the flycatchers, eastern phoebes, starting to move through. Some of the sparrows as well, things like Lincoln sparrow. Later in September, we get things like white-throated and white-crowned sparrow that'll come down south, and the dark-eyed juncos, which overwinter here. So juncos will start arriving pretty soon as well. And then, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, in terms of shorebirds, we probably won't see too many because where the walk is, but we could see killdeer moving through. They like agricultural fields. You could have waterfowl going overhead, things like shovelers, winged and green-winged teals. Yeah, so there's a lot of things we can see. Yeah. All right, if nobody else has any more questions, I think I'm to wrap it up. Oh, we have another question. One swan at Mary Lake where there used to be 4 or 6. I think this one is not well. The other ones might have migrated. Depends on what type of swans they are. Usually the only ones that pass through in migration this time of year will be the tundra swans, trumpeters, which were reintroduced or introduced, depending on who you ask, after being extirpated, or maybe they were never in Southern Ontario in the first place. It's all very political and contentious. They overwinter most of the time, so they'll spend the whole winter here. The odd tundra swan will overwinter here. Like there's been one or two that hang out at Tommy Thompson Park over the past few winters. Those swans with the orange bills and the really curved necks, are called mute swans, and they're an introduced species from Europe, and they also overwinter. So it's possible that they were like a breeding pair, and the young have just dispersed, head off to their own areas, their own ponds. That might explain that. And then Susan also asked, which hawk do we see along the highway every field or so? Those are generally red-tailed hawks you see at the side of the highway, especially perched on telephone wires or sort of soaring, flapping every once in a while. They're big and bulky. They have that sort of beefy barrel-chested appearance that the bootios have. Although you can see other species, things like Cooper's hawks at the side of the road as well. But most of the ones you're seeing in throughout most of North America at the side of the highway are red. All right. Well, thank you all for joining me this evening. It's been a great experience. I look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar, and I hope you all enjoy fall birding and get to go out there and see some cool wildlife. I'll see you. Bye.